Good morning. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you all so very much for joining us. And to our members and viewers who have been providing support for our programming, the staff and I thank you from the bottom of our heart. For those of you who are new to the Council Town Hall, we are a nonprofit 501c3 with the mission of informing our members and our audiences about the most compelling international, national, and regional issues. We are a nonpartisan organization, and an important part of our programs is that we enable our audiences to ask questions of our speakers to foster a more engaged discussion. When the pandemic restrictions hit us in March, we pivoted from our usual in-person programs to these live streams, which we are offering for free as a public service. Our former in-person programs provided us with important revenues to keep our programs going. So that's why we can't do this without your support. Please stay tuned for 30 seconds at the end of this program to find out how you can help us keep these quality programs going. And we thank you so very much for your support. It is now my great pleasure to introduce today's program, How to Win the Tech Race with China, with Anja Manuel, co-founder and partner of Rice Hadley Gates Manuel, and Alex Wang, our moderator, who is a law professor at UCLA School of Law. Now, one of the best parts of our programs is you can ask questions of our speaker and moderator. There's a control panel on the right-hand side of the screen where you can type in your questions. Claire Krelitz, our Manager of Communications and Marketing, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, which will start in about 20 or 25 minutes. Anja, Alex, we're so appreciative of you joining us today, and we look forward to a very lively discussion.
Great. Hello, everyone, and good morning. Thank you to the LA World Affairs Council and Town Hall for having us this morning. We're looking forward to a lively discussion about U.S. policy towards China and how China and the tech race between U.S. and China. So I will sort of, this will be a conversational discussion, and I'll be asking Anja a few questions and look forward to hearing her thoughts today on the subject. So Anja, I'd like to start a little bit more broadly to begin with. Before we dive into the tech issue specifically, would love to hear your thoughts on U.S. policy towards China in general. And I guess if I could characterize where we are today, I think arguably we are at the tensest moment in U.S.-China relations in decades. This obviously has to do with China's rise and the sense that that comes at American expense and presents an ongoing threat. And so what do you think of the way the U.S. is responding to that dynamic? How will that change if we're only a few weeks before the elections? If Biden wins, how will that change? And if Trump wins a second term, what do we expect going forward? In other words, what's at stake right now in the election on U.S. policy towards China?
Thanks, Alex. That's a great place to start. Happy to be here with all of you, even though it's virtual. I'm beaming in from the Bay Area. There's a lot at stake in U.S.-China relations, exactly as you just said, Alex. We have had, the relationship has fallen off a cliff between the trade war, the competition over technology, new export controls, new import restrictions, what China has done to be much tougher and much more aggressive militarily in the South China Sea, up in the high Himalayas with India and elsewhere. It's really a dangerous time. And so whoever gets elected on November 3rd, China will be front and center. I think what you've seen from the Trump administration is a policy that's all tough all the time. I think they've done a very good job calling out some of the problems with China that I think the world was underestimating and being a little bit naive about, the fact that there isn't a fair playing field for Western companies, not just US companies, how incredibly assertive Xi Jinping is being. In my personal view, they've also gone a little bit too far. The tariffs haven't really created a level playing field. We're still not where we are. We can we can talk about trade a little bit later. I won't go into it now. But you haven't really deterred any Chinese actions, but boy, you've had a lot of heated rhetoric. I do think that if Vice President Biden is elected in November, what you'll see in January is a direction that's pretty similar. Thoughtful about China, the idea that this is a big competitor, that there are very few areas we can cooperate, but three important differences. One, I think the tone would change dramatically under a Biden administration. You would just ratchet down the rhetoric. You certainly, I don't think we'll see Biden appointees giving speeches essentially calling for the fall of the Chinese Communist Party. You will also see a much bigger emphasis on working with others, working with our friends and allies in Asia. That's the Quad, India, Japan, Australia, and the US, who have been doing a lot together. A lot more emphasis on what you can do with the Europeans to push back jointly, perhaps a renegotiation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership to have the level playing field. So tone will be different, working with allies will be different, and I think there'll be an emphasis on finding at least some areas where we can cooperate. And the two obvious ones, of course, are climate change, where nothing's going to happen unless the US and China and India, the world's three biggest carbon emitters, cooperate. And also, frankly, more cooperation on the pandemic, which we haven't seen very much. So those are the three things I think will differ.
Great, thank you for that. And now, just to clarify, am I taking it right that you would agree that there is a greater risk in the relationship than before that the Trump administration is responding to, but in essence, you're saying, look, you think maybe that response is not the right way to go necessarily. Is that a correct characterization of your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's fair. It takes two. President Trump has been very aggressive towards China, but President Xi is also quite assertive. Some people thought when you know this, because you teach this at UCLA, a lot of people thought when Xi came into power back in 2012 that he would be an economic reformer and then maybe also a political reformer. What you've actually seen is the opposite. So in China, and I'll just give you one vignette, I used to go all the time. Now it's very rare that I go, even before COVID, because so many of the dialogues between Chinese and Americans have ended. And when I go, last time I was there was maybe a year ago, and tried to see two Chinese friends who are academics who I know well enough that I would normally go to their house for tea. Not one, but both of them said, can we just take a walk and please don't bring your cell phone? It's dangerous for them to speak to Americans. And that is because the space for any dissent in China has really diminished. So yes, Trump was quite assertive, I would argue too much so, but it takes two to partner, and Xi Jinping hasn't been a particularly good partner.
Right. Okay. So I think that's a good lead into the discussion about the so-called tech race, right? So we frame this talk as about winning the tech race. Can you tell us, how do you think about this? What exactly is the tech race? What are we talking about? There could be different elements of this, obviously. And so where do you think are the things that we should focus on in the tech race? What is this about?
Yeah, thank you. This is a really important topic, because if you look at the history of countries that have done well and led in the international system, they're always the ones that have the most advanced technologies, from Roman roads to Chinese gunpowder to the British steamships and repeating firearms to, frankly, what the US has had for the past 7 decades, where the internet was invented here. We have had a real lead in all of the key technologies that make the modern world run, and we've become a little bit complacent. So and China understands this, as do other powers like Iran and Russia and others, and they're working incredibly hard to catch up. Rightfully so. A lot of that is perfectly legal. They're pouring a lot of money into semiconductors. They're making sure that their students study STEM. Some of it is nefarious and even illegal, like stealing intellectual property from the West. So there's a race on in the technology world. Who's gonna be the #1 technology power of the future. And well, I'll just leave it there. That's why it's important.
Yeah. Okay, so and you're thinking about kind of the made in 2025 kinds of things. Is this the main thing that you have in mind when you're talking about the tech race, sort of the attempt to claim dominance over the industries of the future?
Yep.
Right.
And let me maybe explain that a little bit, since you and I know, but our audience may not. Made in 2025 is a plan that got put out by the Chinese government several years ago, saying there are basically 10 industries where we need to be the world leaders. Some of them are unobjectionable and frankly great, like electric vehicles. Some of them are semiconductors, which is the building stone for a lot of what goes into technology. Communications, like Huawei with 5G. Advanced manufacturing, that's okay, but some of those things are dual use. So it's a whole series of things where China wants to be first. And they're lesser known than Made in China 2025 are other things like a whole document by the Chinese saying they want to be the dominant ones to determine technology standards going forward, which is really esoteric, but really important because so far the US and the West has sort of said, well, this is how the internet's going to run. This is how communications technology is going to run. Well, that's no longer the case. We have someone who's contesting what those standards will be. And that's a very important thing going forward.
And can you elaborate on how are you thinking about what's at stake here? Are you mainly thinking of this as a security kind of matter, or is it also the economic, the jobs that are at stake in the future? What are the different aspects that are the concerns here?
Yeah,
that people should be aware of?
Absolutely, it's both. So security, of course, is the primary one. If you are the #1 country in artificial intelligence, in communications technology, in semiconductors, I keep mentioning semiconductors, in a few key areas, it means you're also likely to have the military advantage. That's hard power. But more importantly, so much of our economic prosperity comes from the productivity that comes from these new technologies. And this is actually an important point, and you're right to raise it, Alex. What I'm talking about, the context here is, I would not contest China on all areas of technology. And I think actually that's been a mistake by the Trump administration, saying, well, we don't want China to get ahead. We need to be dominant in everything. My approach would be very different. It wouldn't be try to keep China down and keep our technology away from them. It would say, okay, there's a race. Let's race. And let's make sure that the West, from our perspective, remains the leading countries that in the key technologies that frankly are dual use. And I would list just 5. So it's not everything, right? It's just 5. It's communications technology, 5G. You need more than one competitor, Huawei. I keep mentioning semiconductors. Let me explain why. They are the chips that go into every computer, and it's the building block of everything else we do with computers, including artificial intelligence. So those are critical. And the US is still ahead. China is working hard to catch up. It is artificial intelligence, not all parts, but some parts are so powerful and have also military uses that's critical. And then it's some pieces of biotechnology that are dual use that can be used as bioweapons. And then financial technology. We can talk about these in more detail. But in fintech, China is really ahead. I mean, Alipay, I'm sure you've lived in China, but they're just amazing at payment systems. They have their own digital currency now. And in the US, what you're seeing is regulatory death by
much more mainstream, right? Much more mainstream in China in that regard. Yeah, so I think that's a great comment, and that leads us. So you made the point that the sort of trying to stop China's forward movement in these areas is not as optimal an approach as just essentially out-competing, doing better, performing better. So that leads into a couple of questions, and I'll throw a few of them out here right now for you to respond to. One is, then how would you evaluate what the Trump administration has been doing, right? That naturally brings up well, what have they been actually doing, and where does it fall within your spectrum? And then second, what does that mean for things that bring up a slightly different issue, like the TikTok and WeChat issue? Like, we can debate how much of a issue is actually there and how much of it is bluster, but at least there the idea is about in part sort of privacy, access to American data, consistency with American values, and whether there's censorship and these types of things. So brings in a slightly separate set of issues. And do you respond to that in a different way than you've been discussing? Or so let me leave it at that and let you respond to those two questions.
Thank you. Yeah, let me take them one by one. What has the Trump administration done? Two things. They have called out the issue, and I think rightfully so. They have also done a whole lot on the defensive side. And here I would say some was important and necessary, and some I would say is probably overreach. So what have they done? There is a really a law that not many people know about called CFIUS, which basically restricts, for national security reasons, some investments by foreign companies in American companies. And it used to be very limited. It's like, are you going to invest in an American company that builds tanks, right? Now that you have artificial intelligence, you have these other things, that's gotten a lot broader. And the Chinese in particular were doing a lot. At some point in 2016, 2017, they were part of 10% of all venture capital deals in Silicon Valley. Some of that unobjectionable, but some of that really companies that were fronts for the Chinese military that were trying to invest in our most advanced technologies. So the Trump administration worked with Congress and created a tougher set of laws that makes that harder. That's a positive thing. Maybe on the margins, you would adjust it a little bit of positive. They've also done a whole lot on export controls. So making it harder for American companies to sell their technology to China. Some of that great. Some of it, the tech companies would tell you, is probably overreach because some of that technology is already widely available around the world. If the Chinese don't get it from us, they'll get it elsewhere. And importantly, the US did it alone, back to my point of having allies. So, for a lot of these things, if you can't get it from America, you get it from the Netherlands, or you get it from Germany, or you get it from Israel. So positive, but it's all been defensive. The goal here is to basically build a moat around American technology. It's just not how tech works. You and I live here in California. When you look at the big companies, Facebook, Microsoft, Google, they have their advanced AI researchers in the US, sure, but also in Israel, in China, in Europe. Right?
It's very globalized.
This technology has already flown. When we're talking again about chips and semiconductors, many of the best ones are designed here in the US, but then they're manufactured in Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, exported to China, where they get put into all the devices that are in all of our pockets and sent back all over the world. So it's a little naive to think that we can go back to the 1960s where tech is really nationalist. But that's what I would say what the Trump administration has done. They have explained the problem and sort of called the alarm, and then a lot of defensive things. And finally, of course, the one that everyone's heard about is basically the administration went around the world and said, beware of Huawei's 5G, and please don't unknowingly put it in.
Yeah, and how do you think of the moves against Huawei, against, you could put TikTok and WeChat in the category maybe, but because there's debate over whether it's an overestimation of the risk and, again, sort of bluster and acting tough, or is it reflecting a real risk? Where do you come out on how we should think about that?
Yeah, I'll take them one by one. On Huawei, there really are security concerns. When I talk to my friends who are in the intelligence community, it's not that Huawei's 5G systems have been used to spy, although we don't know. But it is clearly possible to use those routers and antennas and have the Chinese government spy on whatever is going across those networks. That's one. Two, and more important, is that 5G will not just be running your mobile phones, but it'll be running all of the Internet of Things. So the self-driving cars, the electricity grids. And so theoretically, you're giving one Chinese company, if you have Huawei 5G, the ability to turn off your electricity grid. Now, that's an oversimplification, but the concern was real. I think the way the administration went about it was a little bit ham-handed to basically yell at the world to stop using Huawei as opposed to coming up with a good alternative. But the impetus was correct. TikTok and what's happening with WeChat, I think that is different and I would say more problematic. When I talk to friends who are cybersecurity experts, yeah, theoretically, TikTok houses a lot of its data in China, and theoretically, now everybody knows how my preteens dance. Okay.
Right. So you say problematic in the sense that it's not as, maybe the risk is not as great as it's being presented.
Exactly. The risk is not as great. And here, my view is privacy and data privacy is incredibly important. But why don't we get our act together and pass a data privacy law in the United States that can apply to all companies equally? So not just TikTok and Tencent and WeChat, but also Facebook and Google and lots of others. That's long overdue. We haven't done it. And it looks like we're discriminating against two Chinese companies, which we are, which just invites discrimination by China against our companies.
Yeah, that's a good lead in then to the general question of what do you think should be done then going forward? Can you elaborate? You've already alluded to some of the things you think should be done, but maybe if you could elaborate on really what should we do going forward now?
Yeah, I think what I've said is we're trying to hunker down and build a moat about U.S. technology, all defensive. So what would an offensive, positive strategy look like? We've done this before, right? The U.S. can do this. We're good at it. Here are a couple of things I think we need to do. First, and this is actually the hardest one, our science and technology, our STEM education needs to improve. China is incredible. They crank out something like 5 to 10 times more STEM graduates than the US. That's partly a factor of size, but a lot of those people are also really, really good. Some of that is hard. At K-12, that's a state issue. But at the university level, where so many of our grad students and undergrads, I'm sure you see at UCLA, in science and technology disciplines are international students. A lot of them are Chinese students. Instead of keeping Chinese students out, which is what the Trump administration has talked about doing, I would say, let's have a small program. This is not very expensive. It's a couple of $1 billion a year. We're spending trillions on COVID response. To have a program like Eisenhower put in place after Sputnik, where you say, if you're an American and you want to study these disciplines, we're going to give you a full scholarship. That should be an easy thing to do. So that's STEM education. Research and development. The federal government at the height of the Cold War spent 2% of our GDP on federal research and development. So when you look at where much of Silicon Valley came from, it came from those federal government grants. And then they went on and created all these great technologies, and then there was private funding that followed on from that. That R&D funding from the federal side has shrunk every year pretty precipitously under the Trump administration to where it's now something like 0.7% of GDP. I'm not saying going all the way back to the 1960s, but clearly we need to do more. The private sector in the US does a lot of R&D, but it's not necessarily the stuff that's national security related. So yeah, you do a lot of R&D on Snapchat, but that's not helping us stay competitive in the world.
Right.
Not to belittle Snapchat.
Yeah, right.
So those are two important things.
Yeah,
They're
research and education. Yeah.
Others, but the bottom line is, how do we build ourselves up instead of tearing them down?
What about, would you go so far as to, there's been a hot debate for many years about industrial policy, essentially, right? So China, we know, heavily subsidizes, heavily supports its industries. Just in the area that I work on, renewable energy, right? It's brought the cost of solar and wind down dramatically. And there's been so much subsidy that it's led to massive trade disputes with Europe and the United States. to what extent should the U.S. go in that direction? Beyond just the education and research, but actually to sort of support, right? We know how the politics of this plays out in the U.S. Solyndra was a case where there was deep divides between Republicans and Democrats on whether there should be that sort of support. But we should also admit that we do it already, right? With their subsidies for fossil fuel industries and these types of things. So
we do. Yeah. That's a really good point to raise. Industrial policy always gets a bad name because by nature it's a little bit uncompetitive. China, exactly as you said, does a huge amount of it. They're pouring hundreds of billions into the semiconductor industry, for example. So I would say in a very few narrow industries, I would say some subsidies are warranted. And one that I keep bringing up, for example, is semiconductors. Fabs are expensive. Those are the factories that make the microchips. The Trump administration has actually done something really positive in this regard. They did a lot of negative, like you can't export any chip designed in the US to Huawei. It's basically shutting down Huawei. But they've also created some incentives for TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor, which is the most advanced semiconductor company in the world. Others would argue, but it's very, very good, to build a fab in Arizona. Now, the people who really know this tell me maybe then they're not going to put the most advanced chips there, which would be a problem. But I think occasionally you can do things like that. Broadly, I would say that, for example, you mentioned Solyndra and clean tech. Rather than giving, picking winners and losers, having the government choose who gets grant money and who doesn't. Yeah. Can we go back to the carbon tax, which is just more equal, and we'll let the best technologies win. So mostly I would say, look, let's let the market decide. But yes, in a certain very narrow national security relevant areas, I would support some industrial policy.
Right. Okay. And what about then? I guess you've called them defensive measures, but also more punitive measures. Is there still a need for that or room for that? And how would you do that more properly? I guess since you've criticized some of the ways it's been done. And is it necessary, for example, for the types of things like sales of U.S. technologies to Xinjiang for use in security applications within China? Arguably contributing to human rights violations in China, these types of things. Is there a need for the punitive measures, and how do you do them correctly then? In your view?
It's interesting. Oh, I'm so glad you raised Xinjiang and the human rights pieces, because of course export controls in the US and elsewhere are designed to keep technology that's defense relevant and national security relevant out of the wrong hands, right? So no nuclear weapons proliferation, right? That's kind of the beginning of this, or anything that can help you build a nuclear weapon. Well, that's really hard to do when most technology in the current world is commercial and dual use. So it is very easy to overreach. And the people who really do export controls would say really high walls around a very small garden. That's great. Okay, but what's in the garden? What's not in the garden? And it gets really complicated. So I think the way I would improve this is to have a permanent standing technology committee of academics and industry folks who advise the people within Treasury and Commerce who are making most of these hard calls on export restrictions, and can be really quick to change and malleable. So you don't get these big categories. You say, well, this is export restricted. And you also, the important thing, and I said this earlier, is you don't need export controls and things that are widely available in the market, where if you can't buy it here, you'll go somewhere else to get it. And that's why you need a united front of a couple of different countries on very few items. Very hard to get this right.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think let me ask you one more question, and I believe we're supposed to move over to Q&A. But let me ask you this last question before we get into the Q&A. How do you see? How is the rest of Asia responding to China's rise? And you can talk about it more generally, or with respect to tech in general. This obviously has implications for your discussions about alliances. The backdrop for people who may not follow this, China is building alliances with a lot of countries, right? In the UN, there's been a lot of concern about China's rising influence in the UN and their ability to essentially get votes from a lot of countries. Like, how is this playing out in the tech area? Maybe you could focus on that. Is it the case that if the US goes out and tries to build these alliances that they will be met with open arms, or has the tendency to not support these alliances already meant that these countries have gone to China and built the ties that now creates a sort of path dependency going forward with China there?
Right, absolutely. Great topic. Let me take it in two parts. So traditional alliances are, of course, military alliances. NATO, our bilateral alliance with Japan, with Australia. Those have been battered in this administration, and I would say the next president would do well to do a lot to rebuild them. We can talk about that more in the Q&A session. For one example in Asia is the Trump administration is trying to charge both Japan and South Korea multiples of what we have been charging for us to be based there. That's ridiculous, because American troops being based in Japan and South Korea helps secure us as much as it helps secure them. We're not mercenaries. But so let me just put the military alliances to one side. When you're talking about the tech space, obviously there are no tech alliances, right? There are no trade alliances. And so you need to be a little bit more creative about how you bring people on board. And here I've written a couple of papers on an idea that Mike Brown has talked about this, who runs DIUX, which is the defense outpost in Silicon Valley, and others. We call it the Technology 10. It's just a name. But the idea is that you would get like-minded countries together to address one by one these issues that you and I have talked about. Okay, how does the West stay in the lead in semiconductors? So you'd have a working group with the countries that are really great on semiconductors, and that's probably Japan, South Korea, the Netherlands, the US, maybe one or two others. And do you put a pot of money together for industrial policy to build some fabs that are the most advanced? Do you pour more money into R&D in that space? So that's one. Another one, you could have a totally separate group that says, how do you create ethical standards for what artificial intelligence can do and can't do? You probably can't get to standards with China yet because it's just too different. But there you might have a broader group. You certainly would have India at the table and Israel at the table, because they're quite good at that particular technology. And maybe for that, eventually you bring in China, because you want rules of the road that are the same for everyone. So when I say a Tech 10 alliance, I don't mean these particular countries and keep everybody out. It's issue specific, but boy, that's not happening at all. I mean, it's really not. And it's time to get moving.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. So I think right now I should then hand the microphone over to Claire Krelitz, who's managing the question queue. So go ahead, Claire. So thank you very much, Anja. That was terrific.
Thanks, Alex.
And that final question of Alex's kind of segues into what a lot of our audience members are wondering about, which is sort of the international affairs piece. So our first audience question is, can you talk about how Europe views these same technology concerns with China? What is their approach?
Yeah. Oh, perfect segue. Thank you for asking that. So Europe, for a long time, was very sanguine about what China was doing. I would say up to 3 or even 2 years ago, you would hear the Europeans say things like, America's overreacting. They don't like Trump anyway. And say things like, well, if the US isn't going to sell to China, that's a market opportunity for us. You don't hear that anymore. And now all of a sudden, I've taken a part in a lot, but there is a large number of track 2 dialogues between the US and Europe about how to jointly handle China and manage China's rise. Because the Europeans are also seeing, oh, yeah, they're also stealing our intellectual property. Oh, they're really bullying us and our diplomats. Right? And for a while, China was really good at doing that bilaterally, like they arrested a Chinese Swede. There was an uproar in Sweden, and then there was a big bullying event of the Chinese diplomats, of the Swedish diplomats. And there are all sorts of little isolated things like that, that finally the Europeans connected the dots and said, oh, this is a little bit dangerous. And so this is actually the moment to create an alliance or a grouping like the one I talked about in the Tech 10, where you would say, okay, let's get together, and for each of these really critical topics, let's come up with a common approach to them.
Thank you. Next one, can you comment on security and military concerns, not just for the US, but also for the countries in Southeast Asia who feel a more direct impact from China?
Yeah, perfect. This gets best back to the original idea of alliances I talked about. And I just hinted at it in the beginning, but let's just understand what's going on. In the South China Sea, China believes they own basically all of it, this vast tongue-shaped area that they call the 9-dash line. Within it lie a lot of atolls and half-submerged islands, a lot of fishing grounds, and a lot of, they think, undersea oil. And this has really gotten dangerous. So the Chinese military, sometimes Chinese fishing boats, but that act sort of with the okay of the Chinese military, will ram Vietnamese and Filipino and other ships in the area. Those atolls and islands the Chinese have built on, including landing strips for fighter jets, right? They've put anti-aircraft batteries on them. So this is getting really dangerous. That's the South China Sea. The East China Sea, there are some disputed islands between Japan and China, which of course have had a terrible relationship. They fought in World War II and elsewhere. They've always been at each other's throats. Very dangerous. And now China also has started incursions in the high Himalayas. They have a very long, thousands of kilometer border that's very ill-defined with India. And just, they've done it a couple times before, but this summer was the first time in decades that it was really deadly. 20 Indian soldiers died in the skirmish, and an unknown number of the Chinese won't say how many casualties they had. So China's feeling its oats, and they're doing dangerous things all over the place. And in Asia, unlike in Europe, you don't have one strong military alliance. You don't have a NATO. And so you get bits and pieces of people coming together. India has really stepped up. I mentioned the Quad. So India, Japan, Australia, and the US now do a lot of military exercises together. Their foreign ministers just met in Japan 2 weeks ago. They're starting to do a lot more together, even though that's not a formal alliance the way that NATO is. The smaller states in Southeast Asia are, some of them are cowed and nervous about China and don't want to speak up. The Philippines has Duterte running the country, who's been very pro-Chinese, but is backing off from that a little bit. Vietnam is, you know, small but mighty, pushing back very hard, building up its military, but it's a very dangerous situation. And there isn't one community of nations or alliances that's managing it. Long answer, but complicated issue.
Great, and this question is a little similar but different, and it comes from another friend of the council, the director of the USChina Institute, Clayton Doobie, who we hosted in the spring, and he says, Anja, you focused on South Asia while working in the State Department. How does South Asia fit into the US-China relationship? Is China now more important to Pakistan than the US? Is India in a position to contribute to a collective trade and security agreement?
Oh yeah, great question. So I did work on South Asia, so India, Pakistan, Afghanistan at the State Department. Actually, Nick Burns and we worked at State together. We just published an op-ed on this last week on how does India fit into all this. And India used to be quite sanguine about China. And just in the last 4 or 5 years, they've gotten very worried, even before this incursion. You know, the too many Chinese goods coming in, flooding their market, similar to what was happening in the US. Unfair playing field for Indian companies in China, stealing of IP, and now this big border dispute. So India has done a lot to step up to push back on China, and frankly, that's moved it way closer to the US. It's like the one bipartisan issue you can still find in Washington is India, and we should have closer relations with them. And that has been from Clinton to Bush to Obama to Trump. It's consistent across administrations. Positive relations with India are important. So that's one. Pakistan has, partly as a result, but partly independently, become closer and closer to China. So it is kind of the jewel of the Belt and Road Initiative. The Chinese have promised, every time you look, it's more, something like $40 billion in aid to Pakistan through Belt and Road. It's really important to understand that these are loans, not grants. Like when the US gives aid, it's a gift. When China gives aid, it's a loan that needs to be repaid. But there is some good stuff. The Chinese have built a big port in Pakistan called Gwadar. They've built a lot of roads, a lot of electricity. All of that was highly necessary. And the Chinese and the Pakistanis are becoming closer and closer and closer. It's not a formal military alliance, but it's a pretty close relationship.
Great. This next question is short, but I think very interesting. Can a democratic country win the tech race?
It is a really interesting question. 100%. In fact, I think democratic countries have an advantage. The open system that we have at our universities, where we attract the best and the brightest from around the world, and they want to come study at UCLA, they want to come study at Stanford or Berkeley or MIT, that's a real competitive advantage. The idea that our companies are free to build the tech that they want. They're not constantly have a watchful eye of the government saying, you can do this, you can't do this, I need this backdoor, I need that backdoor, and by the way, you should censor everything in this way. Enormously helpful for innovation. It's very hard to innovate in an authoritarian society, although, you know, China is doing it. But no, we have huge advantages. So we need to just build on them and not squander them.
Thank you. How do we address Chinese restrictions and censorship on US search engines and social media in China that undermine free speech principles governing US search engines and social media companies?
Yeah, the censorship is an important issue. So, you know, there isn't really an American tech company, social media, or search engine that's really doing any business in China. The one I know that got in was LinkedIn, but I haven't heard much about it. I'm not sure how well they've done in China. Facebook, of course, is not in. Google is not in. So there is absolutely no freedom of expression in China. And they also haven't wanted to put the camel's nose under the tent, if you will, by letting American companies in. What's hard is you see this Chinese increasingly tough restrictions on speech bleeding into what happens in the US. You know, you saw it with the NBA, and last year someone said something negative about China, and then the Chinese said, well, we're just going to pull the NBA games. We're going to lose millions and millions of dollars. You see it bleeding into Hollywood. You know, this is the LA World Affairs Council. A lot of self-censorship in Hollywood because the biggest movie market in the world is now actually China. So if you're going to make that big action flick, you want it to be successful in the US, Europe, but also in China. So you're certainly not going to make your villain Chinese. So some of that is not a big deal and sometimes overplayed, but some of it really is a big deal. And it's really important. And I think you solve it by calling attention to it and helping the companies that are trying to do the right thing. And let me actually, there was one issue that Alex and I talked about earlier that's similar to this that maybe I'll pick up now. And that was, Alex, you asked if there should be export controls on things that will harm human rights, like should American companies be allowed to invest in SenseTime and Hikvision and the Chinese companies that are creating basically the surveillance state for the Uyghurs? There have never been any restrictions on that, no human rights-based restrictions. And I think it would probably be a step too far because it's just such a slippery slope, right? Then where can you go, where can you not go? But boy, should there be some sunlight on this? And should American venture capital firms and American companies know what they're investing in? And should they personally say, well, maybe we should do a human rights vetting here before we invest in these companies? I think so. And could you create some model guidelines to that effect? I think that's maybe the place to start. It's a hard issue.
We've got some audience members worried about Taiwan. One question is, what is your take on China's stance towards Taiwan? A lot of speculation that they may do something on that front.
Yeah, boy, we should have another whole session on Taiwan. It was such an issue that was on the back burner for years and years. And now with China, essentially with the national security law swallowing Hong Kong this summer, I think that's how you have to see it. There is no more independent Hong Kong. The Taiwanese are incredibly worried. Will China actually do something? When I talk to friends who are in the US military, they say a real invasion by mainland China of Taiwan is unlikely because an amphibious assault is very difficult and there are lots of cliffs and you can't scale the cliffs. Okay. Is something else more likely where you cut off Taiwan's internet, you strangle them, you have cyber attacks, and you essentially make it so difficult for the current government, the Tsai Ing-wen government, to continue doing what they're doing, that you get a different government in Taiwan that's much more Beijing friendly? Maybe. I can tell you that this is something that went from a sleepy backwater of US foreign policy to front and center. The number of study groups on what to do about Taiwan and what exactly is the US security guarantee to Taiwan and where should the red lines be and how should we message to Beijing has suddenly become front and center. And it's very thorny and it's completely unresolved.
With respect to multilateral institutions, which are most promising venues for US-China cooperation and which are likely to see a high level of conflict?
These are great questions. Your audience is fantastic. In the past few years, the US and China have not collaborated well in international institutions. The IMF and World Bank have traditionally been pretty good. If the US, I believe it was a mistake for the US not to join the AIIB, which is China's development bank that they set up that actually was really trying to use globally accepted standards for environment and labor and things. The people who run it are really Western friendly. It would have been nice if we had a seat at that table. That I think is a potential future area of cooperation. I think there's no reason that we shouldn't be cooperating at the World Health Organization. Yes, that organization has problems like all international organizations. Yes, they probably should have been a little tougher on China, but us picking up our ball and going home, in my view, is the wrong way to do it. You opt in and you say, all right, everybody pay your fair share. How are we going to reform this? What are we going to do? The WTO, as much as it's been vilified, that's the World Trade Organization, it's working. They just came out with a ruling that said the Trump administration tariffs on China on 250 billion of Chinese goods is wrong, and the Chinese can retaliate. It's very imperfect, but boy, it's the best we've got. And we've seen with COVID, what I would, I guess, call the revenge of the nation state, and how hard it is to deal with these big international issues if it's every country for itself. America first, Brazil first, India first, China first. It hasn't worked very well for us, and it would be better if we were more collaborative, including with the Chinese on many of these issues.
I would just make a plug for the climate collaboration also, UN climate collaboration. That's a potential area for positive and or less conflictual collaboration in the international.
And Alex, do you think that's gone well through the UN? The US
that's part of it. I mean, I would argue that prior to the Paris Agreement that it did go well. Whether that was formally through the UN or not is a separate question. I think the U.S. and China have a lot of direct contact on those issues, but it all revolved around the annual kind of cycle of negotiations through the UN process. So U.S.-China collaboration in that area, I think, will continue to be a bright spot. If Biden wins in particular, it's an area of real opportunity.
I think that's right. Thanks.
Thanks. Is the PRC likely to see an increased U.S. commitment to industrial policy as an offensive stance rather than a defensive one? Are there steps that the U.S. can take that are less likely to raise alarm or provoke retaliation?
Very good question. I think at this point, the relationship between the US and China is so battered that on this front, it's just going to feel competitive, and whatever the US does will feel it. But I do think what I mean by positive offensive isn't like aggressive anti-China. It's actually the opposite. What I'm arguing for is let's just get our house in order and be really good at it rather than trying to keep them down. So all of these steps that I've talked about actually should be considered less aggressive by the Chinese. Whether they'll actually see it that way is hard. I mean, if you look at Chinese state-owned media now, and even the ones that have a degree of independence like Caixin and others, there's a steady anti-American beat that's really strong. And some of my friends who spend their whole lives on China policy would say that even in the, sorry, someone just came in. Actually, one of my friends has written this. It says that the mishandling of the COVID crisis by China was the biggest moment where Xi Jinping's power could have been not absolute, or where he actually could have fallen, but that you now have a situation where because of how aggressive the Trump administration has been, he's solidly locked in. It's actually reinforced his position in China.
Thank you. Trump constantly touts the China trade deal. Is China still cooperating with the U.S. on terms of that deal?
To some extent, yes, they are, and but in small things. So phase one of the trade deal was always really small and modest. There was some real work done on intellectual property. That's actually really good, and I hear that some of that is actually moving forward. The Chinese committed to opening their financial sector to more U.S. investment. Easy give for them because they wanted to do that anyways. It helps them. But I hear from financial companies that that's moving forward. On the purchasing part, which was this part of the deal that was going to deal with our trade deficit with China and make sure that China buys U.S. farm goods again, which, by the way, they were buying a ton of before we slapped tariffs on them. That's not really happening. You know, things are really much, they're buying less than half of what they committed to, partly because of COVID, but partly because that part of the deal just never made a whole lot of sense. Excuse me for 1 second.
Yeah. Alex, this I can maybe direct to you.
Sure.
It sounds like we might need a stronger UN for global issues. How might we achieve that?
Well, I think, in my view, just U.S. exit from the UN is obviously, I think that's not very helpful at all. And I think there's been a sense that the administration wants to limit other countries like China from gaining influence in the UN, but yet even as the U.S. is exiting. So I think that's a contradictory position, and it's no surprise that China would rise in influence if there's a vacuum being created by the U.S. So I think engagement and alliances, these types of things that Anja's been talking about, seem to be the right way to go going forward.
Sounds right.
Great, thank you. And this will be the final audience question, although we have so many, as I'm sure you can imagine. There's been a few people who've been asking about Hong Kong, so I'll just read one, but if you want to spend a little bit of time talking about that, please do. How does China's tech and economic growth relate to the future of Hong Kong? Has the central government decided that they no longer need Hong Kong's special status, or is the crackdown purely a political/emotional call?
Yeah, it's a very astute question. So Hong Kong, of course, was supposed to be one country, two systems. In 1997, when the basic law was put into place, the idea was that Hong Kong would be democratic with a democratically elected government, with freedom of speech, with freedom of press. This summer, with what happened with the national security law being passed, essentially there is no freedom of speech and no freedom of press. It means that mainland China can take anyone into custody. They've done a lot of that. I mean, there was one way this could have gone where they put the draconian law in place, but then don't enact it. That's not true. A lot of people have been arrested. It's extremely dangerous and incredibly sad. Just really incredibly sad. So now what happens? You know, what can the world do? The world, not just the US, but other countries Hong Kong had this special status. We had special trade deals with them, and we've removed that. We've also put some sanctions on the people who are responsible for putting the national security law in place. That seems like the right thing to do. I think the Trump administration has actually been appropriate on this. I wish Europe would do a little more. They've done less, frankly. But ultimately, it's not going to deter mainland China or push this back. And I think they've decided, the Chinese, that, well, we're going to make it a greater Bay Area approach. So all the big cities that are around Hong Kong, and build those up, build Shanghai up as a financial center, and then you won't need Hong Kong as much as you did. So I think the premise of the questioners of the question is correct. Sad but true. Alex, do you have something to add on that?
Well, if I can make a plug, next Thursday at UCLA Law School, we're doing a panel on the Hong Kong national security law. So I agree with what you just said about Hong Kong, but we have Jerry Cohen and Christine Lowe and others talking about the implications of the national security law. So a lot of these things you just mentioned, we'll be trying to unpack those things. So I think that is certainly the direction that things are going.
It's enormously sad, and it's a reminder that much of the world always thinks the US is all powerful. We're really not. There's not very much we can do to roll something like this back.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much on behalf of our audience. And Alex, I'm going to turn this back over to you.
Thanks, Claire.
Great. Thanks, Claire. All right, so I guess we're at time. So Anja, I'll give you a chance to have any closing remarks right now, but I think it's been a great discussion, and thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you, Alex. I really enjoyed it, and I just want to end on an optimistic note. You know, it feels like the U.S. is on the back foot. It's a hard election cycle, but we've been through harder, right? We came through the Great Depression. We came through the 1960s and the civil rights movement, and we came out of all of these things stronger. And all of the things I talked about building ourselves up, fixing our STEM education, fixing our R&D system, and standing up and saying, okay, you want to have a competition? Some things we can cooperate on, but on these issues, you want to have a competition? Let's do it. We're totally capable of this. And I think if we just get down to it, we will be successful. So thank you. Thank you very much for having me. And I really enjoyed the conversation.
Alex and Anja, thank you so much. As Alex said, this was a very important discussion, and we were so blessed to have both of you with your expertise here today. We have to have you back. This is an ongoing discussion, and as Claire said, we have so many questions from our audience that we weren't able to get to. So thank you both so very much. And to our audience, we can't do this without you. So please, if you enjoyed this quality discussion and programming, please text the word GIVE to the number on the screen and help us keep these going. We have a terrific program tomorrow with Professor Dan Schnur, who will be talking about the upcoming debate tomorrow night and the majority of the Senate and other things that are hitting us every day in the headlines. Please visit our website, sign up for our programs, become a member, make a donation. Everybody, please stay safe, stay informed, and we'll see you soon.